Here is a cover page of the book, Pain is Really Strange by Steve Haynes, published in 2015. It's a paperback. I found this picture interesting to fit into my topic. The title of the book is Pain is Really Strange. Today, we will look into the processing of pain at various levels of neuraxis. In the last class, we covered the definition, the receptor, the pathway, and the representation of pain. And today, what we will be doing, the pain processing at various levels. Before I proceed with the processing part, let us know the definition of pain again. It is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or injury. Unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage. Briefly about the pain pathway. Here I have jotted down the points for you. One, the nociceptors. Nociceptors present here in the periphery in the skin. These nociceptors are free nerve endings, and these free nerve endings are carried by A delta fibers and C fibers. The nociceptors, free nerve endings in the skin, various tissue compartments, carried by A delta and C fibers. These are the A delta. This is A delta fiber and this is C fiber. They come to the spinal cord. This is the spinal cord here, and the lamina 1, 2, and 5. Then they relay there, and the projecting neurons, here is the projecting neuron in the lamina 5, that would cross to the opposite side, ascend as a lateral spinothalamic tract. This lateral spinothalamic tract is being divided into 3 different aspects for all your considerations. One is a neospinothalamic tract. So this is a neospinothalamic tract. It is the same thing, the spinothalamic tract, mostly receiving information from A delta fibers. And this is the neospinothalamic tract, reaches the thalamus and relays into the ventroposterolateral nucleus of thalamus, and then it will be projected on, or it will be finally relayed on somatosensory cortex. S1, the postcentral gyrus, Brodmann area 312. It is for localization and identification of the attributes. So that is the neospinothalamic tract. Then we have another. It is not the most of the fibers reach there. Some of the fibers they will ascend as a paleospinothalamic tract. These paleospinothalamic tract have relays in the medulla, in the pontine area, that is a parabolical nucleus, and in the periaqueductal gray, and they relayed on a different nuclei of the thalamus. That is, these different nuclei are the medial dorsal nucleus of thalamus. The medial dorsal nucleus of thalamus is connected to the cingulate cortex, or ventro-posterior nucleus of thalamus, that is being supplying the insular cortex. So this forms the paleo-spinothalamic tract, where they are connected to the limbic system. They are connected to the insular cortex, and by that, the affective component, the emotional component of the pain is processed. That's the second part. A third part of this spinothalamic tract, they release in the reticular system, the medullary, the mesenchymal, the spino-reticular tract. So they are relayed in the rostroventral medulla, here in the medulla, or even the parabrachial nucleus in the upper pontine region, and in the periaqueductal gray of the midbrain. Then from these, what we get a descending inputs to the spinal cord to check the inputs reaching to the site. That is about the spinoreticular inputs. So this is spinoreticular inputs. The fibers reaching the periaqueductal gray are known as a spinomesenchymal. This is briefly about the pathway, pain pathway. Now, this same thing, what I have done, I am just putting it in 4 different numbers there. Lateral spinothalamic tract, it is a neospinothalamic tract, and they have wide dynamic range neurons in the layer 5 of the spinal gray matter. They receive inputs from A delta mostly, and partly C fibers, and the axons cross and ascend to the VPL and relay in thalamus area, Brodmann area 312 or somatosensory area 1. Then the spino-reticular relay, they are here in the rostroventral medulla and also the parabrachial nucleus, and this is all reticular system. They relay, the spino-reticular relay, they project onto the autonomic components. That means they try to manipulate the autonomic things, especially the blood pressure and respiration, and the visceral components. And they will have reticulothalamic projections to the that's the intralaminar nucleus and the reticular nucleus for a non-specific arousal response of the entire cortex, and the descending bulbospinal projections, So if I go back, you have these the descending bulbospinal. These are bulbospinal projections coming from the medulla. Okay. Now, third is the relay in the parabrachial nucleus. This assumes a importance. This forms the part of the paleo-spinothalamic tract, and this parabrachial nucleus relays onto the amygdala, and from the amygdala it is connected to the insular cortex and also to the cingulate cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex. And you have the parabrachial nucleus is connected to hypothalamus here, and amygdala and hypothalamus are interconnected. In addition to these things, the paleo-spinothalamic tract, as I was trying to talk about, they will be relayed in the medial dorsal nucleus of thalamus and ventromedial posterior nucleus of thalamus. This VMPO that connects to insular cortex, the medial dorsal nucleus connects to the cingulate cortex. That is about the parabrachial relay. Fourth relay is on neurons of the rostroventral medulla and the periaqueductal gray. They will send, they are essentially, they are for the descending inputs, the descending inhibitory inputs to these ascending fibers for pain control mechanisms. With this brief understanding, we move on to the pain processing at various levels. So now, here I have charted down 11 steps: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 steps, and I have described them here. One is the local site at the site of injury or at the site of receptor. The second is the spinal cord. This is the dorsal horn neurons of the spinal cord. Then we have the medulla. This is the medulla, rostroventral part of medulla and around. Then we have the parabolical nucleus, the frontomedullary area. This is number 4. Then we have the periaqueductal gray that is in the midbrain. This is periaqueductal gray. I just see that the bucket rim of the bucket. Then we have the thalamus. We have thalamus here, and the thalamus is again having the 3 components which are already mentioned. Then the one part, 7th part is to the sensory cortex, S1. Then 8th part is the amygdala. Amygdala is then the cingulate cortex, the insular cortex, the prefrontal cortex. I will just briefly describe how the processing takes place at each level. See what happens. What happens when you have an injury here to the skin? So this is a skin. When the skin is cut or some part of the integument is cut, what happens? There is a release of chemicals. The first, it will excite those nerves. Nerves are injured, especially the fast conducting nerve fibers are activated. So that is a mechanical. This is the lesion, mechanicum, tearing or cutting or whatever, crushing, whatever, this mechanical activate A delta fibers. At the same time, because of the mechanical things, there is an injury or cell destruction. And these cell injury products, especially the potassium is inside the cell, it is potassium. Now potassium is released. And it also contains the hydrogen ion. And this potassium and hydrogen ion then comes, it has prostaglandins inside. They are released. In addition, you will have a number of other chemicals depending upon the cell, that is serotonin, bradykinin, and all these cell injury products, they would be activating the nerve terminal. So these nerve terminal are usually C fiber nerve terminals. So what happens? They will send impulses. They will send impulses to the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, that's the first part. When they send impulses, so some of these collaterals, you just see that these collaterals release, they will activate antidromically these nerve terminals. See, you just see that these nerve, that means the nerve fiber is having number of these things. They will release the nerve terminals, and that would be calcitonin gene regulating peptide and substance P are released from these terminals. That's one part. And what they do, the CGRP and substance P, when they are released, they will act on the tissue histiocytes or the mast cells. And when they are, these mast cells are activated, they release a histamine present within them or other chemicals present within them. And now this will again activate. So this goes on. This process is becoming a positive. At the same time, this also releases the terminals around these blood vessels. These are vasodilators. They produce vasodilatation. So that means this is what we try to mention about a triple response. So whenever there is a scratch, you get something like a triple response. These one will explain that triple response parameters. Anyway, in addition to these tissue injury products, they will induce the inflammation, and the inflammation here will activate the mast cells and other phagocytes or macrophages to enter into the area. And once the macrophages enter in, they will release a number of other chemicals. Those chemicals, besides these histamine, bradykinin, prostaglandin, there will be a number of other chemicals present, the interleukins, cytokines, and many more. All those chemicals further activate these cells, and that would produce the pain, and that would go to DRG. Now, what happens here? The mechanical cut activates the delta fibers that will release the injury and inflammatory chemicals, as I have mentioned, that would activate C fiber. So now the C fiber is activated. The permeability, because histamine, bradykinin, and prostaglandins, they will change the permeability of the tissue or the blood vessels here, and the extracellular fluid, that means the fluid oozes out of the blood vessels. And once the fluid oozes out of the blood vessels, it becomes swollen. It becomes there is a swelling there, and this swelling, what happens? There will be a stretch on the fascia. The swelling results in the stretching of the things, and this stretching is also included with the nerve membrane. Now, what happens? There are chemicals, plus there is a stretch that would activate the cells. And because of the more blood supply to this area, the more blood is flowing through this area, that would increase the temperature of this area. That is a typical of the inflammatory response. So now, once the temperature is increased, temperature further activates or stimulates the trigger this nociceptor. This is a nociceptor there. So that means a nociceptor is a polymodal receptor that can be activated by the mechanical, that is a stretch, that can be activated by the chemicals. The number of chemicals are here, and that can be activated by the thermal sensations. So that will be activated by the thermal sensation. And further, histamine itself activates, or it's also triggers the activation further. All these things produce what is called increased information or increased activity to the spinal cord. Now, what happened? There is an immediate cut. When you have a cut, you see that you have something like that. So what you do, you just take your part. So that means you move the part away and try to shake it. And maybe sometimes you try to get to the eyes, or put it in sometimes you put it in the mouth, and so that I don't know why that reflex has developed, and you will try to get the solace. That is one part. Now, doing that is one of the part of the processing of the at the local level. So that means you try to move the limb or move the part. So that means that itself takes away from the site of injury, no further. Then it will try to move. That means it will move the blood flow in the other directions. Now, the second part, the increased vascularity dilutes the chemicals here, because the number of chemicals released are tremendous, and that will dilute the chemicals. And these chemicals diffuse. Now, they diffuse into because the concentration is greater there and here less, they diffuse into the circulation, and thus they are drained back into the circulation to the heart. So they will be flushed into the heart, into the circulatory system. Then second part about the local processing is a shorting of the response. Shorting is because the pain is carried by a dual pathway. One is a fast and another is a slow pathway. The fast pathway is for the actions, immediate actions. The slow pathway is a continuous actions, so as that this keeps on sending impulses, and it is non-adapting, and it bothers you. It will produce an anxiety, and you will not forget about the pain, and it keeps you worrying about the pain. And that is there are two pathways. One is a fast, immediate reflex actions. The number two is a slow, that produces the emotional response or a anxious nature, and you are worrying, and that forms the another thing. And at the same time, you try to seeking solace. Whenever you have the pain there, all the time you touch the part, gentle touching, and sometimes you rub, and that would produce the massaging effect, a gentle massaging effect. This massaging effect, what it does, it moves away the chemicals accumulated at this site and enters into the circulation. That helps. Sometimes what we do, we just put the ice on the site. Sometimes when we have an injury, you put the ice. So by putting the ice, you are trying to reduce the activity of these nociceptors. The ice that will slow down and that will cool down and that will decrease the threshold for the, or that will increase the threshold for activation, and that would reduce the pain. Move on to the second level. Second level is the spinal cord. And again, in the spinal cord, we have a laminates. That means already it is stratified here. In the spinal cord, it is stratified 1, 2, and 5. Maybe sometimes 3 also. 1, 2, 3, and 5. So 1 and 2 and 5, 1, 2, and 5 layers receive inputs from A delta fibers. 1 and 2 laminae receive input from C fibers. And these inputs, they have a synaptic contact. Synaptic contact here. So say, for example, here 1 and 2 have a synapse with the interneuron there. And this interneuron have a synaptic contact with the projecting neuron situated in the layer 5. This is known as a WDR, wide dynamic range neuron. So that is situated in the, that is a projecting neuron situated in layer 5. So that means we have they have a synaptic contacts. If there is a synapse, it is the synapse provides an opportunity for modulation of pain. So that means that there is a delay, there is a some amount of a dropping in or some other inhibitory things coming up, so that the synaptic modulation may take place. At the same time, there is a convergence of these A delta and the C fiber. So the A delta and the C fibers. So look here, this is the converging neuron. So that is coming from the A delta fibers. These A delta and the C fibers, they will project onto this neuron. These C fibers and A delta fibers, they will be projecting onto the pain fibers, and that will ascend up. Okay, so now these A delta and the C fibers, so this should be delta there. A delta and the C fibers, they are activated because of the injury. Okay, as I was talking. The second is collaterals, because in the spinal cord, they will activate the motor neurons or interneurons that would stimulate the flexor group of muscles. That is for the withdrawal or the withdrawal reflex. That means withdrawing from the site of injury. So this withdrawal reflex is actually activated, and this withdrawal reflex is a part of the nociception. Then these A delta and C fibers, they converge on one projecting neuron, and this projecting neuron is ascending up as a spinothalamic tract. That means there is a convergence with this wide dynamic range neuron. Then this wide dynamic range neuron, this is a wide dynamic range neuron, and this synaptic pathway that receives a number of inputs from the A beta fibers, thick diameter fibers which are carrying touch. So they will be A beta fibers, they will have an inhibitory interneuron on this. They will activate the inhibitory interneuron, they will try to suppress. At the same time, they receive descending inputs. Look here, this is the descending inputs here, and this descending inputs try to suppress this activity. So that means you have a modulators here in this spinal cord, and this modulators try to govern the output going from the wide dynamic range neuron. So this is a wide dynamic range neuron that is going to the thalamus, spinothalamic tract. So these inputs from the descending tract and these inputs, that is the A beta fibers and others, what they do, they activate a number of excitatory and inhibitory transmitters. Here I have mentioned a few excitatory transmitters, substance P, glutamate, serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, or excitatory transmitters. They will excite. Then we have this particular neuron. There is an interneuron there that would project onto this thing. This is encephalinergic. Encephalinergic, that means opiate receptors. So it will try to opiate receptors, and we have a glycine receptors that is inhibitory, and a GABA receptor that is inhibitory, that is being activated. These interneurons here that are being inactivated. So thus in the spinal cord, because it is making a synaptic contact, there is a more possibility for processing. So that means processing in the sense whether to eliminate the particular sensations or to exalt the particular sensation, depending upon the situation. And this processing is one component. At the same time, there will be a convergence. That means a focusing of the impulses which are reaching to the spinothalamic area through these interneurons. So this is the processing at a spinal cord. Now come to the processing at medulla. So look at the, this is the medulla, RVM, the rostroventral part of the medulla, this green area. Now this green area, if you are looking at, it has three components. I have mentioned here three components: descending bulbospinal serotonergic projections, these reticulospinal projections. Reticulospinal projections. These projections descend down, and if you are looking at these descend down, and they suppress these neurons which are ascending up. So these descending projections, that is one of the things which it does in the medulla. That means this would activate the descending projection, this RVM relay, rostroventral medullary relay, activate these neurons that would suppress. At the same time, they would activate the gamma motor neurons that would also be necessary for posture regulation or motor activity. So in addition, you have this is becoming a thalamus, reticular system, and this reticular system projects onto the thalamus. This is thalamus here. And this projects onto the intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus, and also the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. And these intralaminar and the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, they project onto all the areas. You just see that they spread out to the entire cortical mental. So something like an umbrella. This is formed like an umbrella. So that means the cortical mental is activated, especially the relay in the layer 1 of the cerebral cortex, layer 1 of the outer molecular layer of the cerebral cortex, and that would make the excitation that is for the arousal response. These thalamocortical radiations, they are for the arousal response. Then we have these neurons around, they will activate the descending inputs to the sympathetic intermediolateral horn cells of the spinal cord, as well as the parasympathetic division, the vagus and other parasympathetic activity for autonomic responses, to control the heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration, and other visceral sensations. Sometimes you have the vomiting center here, you have the cough center here, everything is here. Sometimes the person with a severe pain may have a vomiting or a visceral responses. So like that, you will get what happens in the medulla. Fourth, what happens in the parabrachial nucleus? This is the parabrachial nucleus. It's in the upper pontine area. So this is the medullary area. This is the upper pontine area. This is the parabrachial nucleus. And this parabrachial nucleus connects to the amygdala, hypothalamus. Amygdala and hypothalamus. Amygdala in turn connects to the insular cortex. This insular cortex, that is a part of the it forms the part of the paleothalamic, spinothalamic tract, that is for the affective or emotional components of the pain. Because this connects with the cingulate cortex. This insula, cingulate cortex, And these two connected with the prefrontal cortex on this side and the limbic system back. So they all together, they form the affective component of the pain. So now what I have mentioned here connects to the amygdala. So this connects to the amygdala. So that means it tells that the pain is coming. And it tells to the hypothalamus that, come on, you reinforce, because the hypothalamus reinforce the autonomic response is happening in the medulla. It will tell the hypothalamus for the reinforcement activity. So, and the emotional responses. Reticular activating system. Further, this is a part of the reticular system. This reticular activating system activates the entire cortical mantex for arousal response. The insular cortical inputs, they will process for the affective pain or the emotional pain or the introspective pain or the pain, its attributes, the intensity and the type and so on. All those things the insular cortex performs. Then we have the cingulate cortex here. This is a cingulate cortex. This is the amygdala, and through the amygdala and also partly through the thalamus, the medial dorsal nucleus of thalamus, they will be relayed into the cingulate cortex, and the cingulate cortex involve again affective component of the pain, and that is in reference to the prefrontal cortex. This is what the parabolical nucleus. That means parabolical nucleus connects. So that means the processing here, it will spread the news to the various sites of concern for the management of pain. So then we have the mesenchymal relay. Mesenchymal relay is mostly in the periaqueductal gray. This is a periaqueductal gray. This is a periaqueductal gray, and see, look here. This is both the somatic and visceral. They converge here, and the output from the projecting neuron that would ascend up as a lateral spinothalamic tract, and it gives a collateral here. Look here, one collateral here to the RVM, and another collateral here in the periaqueductal gray. This is mesenchymal or the midbrain structure, and before ascending up. And this collateral activates the periaqueductal neurons. And these periaqueductal neurons, they are interconnected with the encephalinergic neurons. You have this is the canal there, and see this third ventricle and around. You have the canal there, and you have the CSF there. They release the opiates. So that means there will be encephalinergic neurons which are activated, and that will try to suppress the pain pathway. So now that would suppress. Otherwise, that is one component. So they will suppress it here, and they will also send influences to the hypothalamus and amygdala. They will suppress those amygdalar and hypothalamic activity. In addition, they would activate the projections to the this is the nucleus raphe magnus in the medulla, raphe nucleus in the medulla, and they will activate the raphe nucleus. And once these raphe nuclei are activated, they will send descending projections. So these descending projections are serotonergic projections. These are raphe spinal or bulbospinal projections. They are serotonin containing, and they will try to suppress the pain or the gate of the pain. The second is this will activate sorry about that. The first part is the periaqueductal gray activates the raphe neurons. The bulbospinal outputs, serotonergic projections, they will just suppress the activity. The second is it also activates the locus coeruleus. Locus coeruleus, somewhere situated in the same medullary area, that is the rostroventral medulla. This locus coeruleus is rich in catecholaminergic neurons, so norepinephrinergic neurons. They would also project onto these things. Norepinephrine possesses both the excitatory and inhibitory activity on the projecting neuron here. So these two things, the periaqueductal gray. So now this periaqueductal gray also receives the inputs from the cingulate, from the prefrontal cortex, from the amygdala, and the entire range of the things, and these are projecting on, these are exciting these things. Okay, this is what the processing happens at the mesenchymal relay. I will just read it. Periaqueductal gray inhibits the ascending pain pathway. So that means it will try to inhibit this pathway, maybe at the thalamic level, because they cannot inhibit here in between, maybe at the thalamic level. And projections to the Raphe nucleus, this is a Raphe nucleus, and which try to suppress the pain pathway there and controlling the gate. Then we have the reticular system, because this is also forming the reticular system that will, through the thalamocortical radiations, that would produce the arousal response. And they will also, through the hypothalamus, they will also monitor the cardiorespiratory parameters, especially the autonomic parameters, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And this periaqueductal gray is reciprocally connected with the cingulate cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, insular cortex, and all other areas of the brain, even in the nucleus accumbens, and all those areas are connected, and they will try to influence the inputs. That's about the mesenchymal relay. Regarding the processing at the thalamus. Thalamus is a usually for a sensory modalities. It is one way here, especially if you are thinking about the lemniscal sensations. It is the ventro-posterior lateral nucleus of thalamus that reaches to the somatosensory area, and that is where everything is processed. Now, here in the thalamus, there are three, or especially the four major areas the pain fibers are touching upon. One is VPL. This VPL reaches to the S1 area, and that is for assaulting, relay, and epicritic pain. Then we have another area is just a dorsomedial nucleus of thalamus. This dorsomedial nucleus of thalamus is again coming from the parabrachial nucleus and directly from the collaterals here, and this will connect to the anterior cingulate cortex. Then third one is from the parabrachial nucleus and from these neurons that is relayed into the ventromedial posterior nucleus of thalamus that would go to the insular cortex. Here I have mentioned, and the reticular nucleus, reticular fibers, reticulothalamic fibers, reticulothalamic fibers are relayed in intralaminar and reticular nucleus of the thalamus. So intralaminar and reticular nucleus, so Y-shaped nucleus there. And then we have the posteromedial nucleus to the insular cortex, and then we have the dorsomedial nucleus, which is going on to the dorsomedial nucleus, which goes on to the cingulate cortex. Now, one interesting thing, what happens if we remove the entire cortex? If the parietal cortex, this is ablated, the parietal cortex is removed. This is parietal cortex. Here, that is somatosensory area 1. What happens? This is intact, and the thalamus is intact. In that case, crude pain persists. Very crude form of the pain persists. And the person feels a pain or uneasiness or a discomfort. He will not be able to localize precisely. He will say vaguely, well, it may be in the hand, or in the abdomen or somewhere, whatever the point. So crude pain persists even after parietal cortex ablation. The pain perception is vague and diffuse. It's not precise. And the thalamus also, as we know, thalamus also processes the paleogenetically, the evolutionary wise, some pain that is not very precise as that of the neocortex. However, the autonomic responses, the affective component, the emotional component, which are generated from the insular cortex and the cingulate cortex and the amygdala, persist. So that means emotional component of the pain remains. The precision component of the pain is absent. That is what happens when the parietal cortex is ablated. Now, coming to the parietal cortex, where they are relayed in the parietal cortex, they are relayed in the granular, inner granular layer of the cerebral cortex, layer 4, that is the sensory area. All the thalamocortical projections, the specific thalamocortical projections reach the thalamocortical area, that cortical area, layer 4, that is the granular layer. And this inner granular layer, from here, the various areas are interconnected, and that's one part, especially in the VPL, ventroposterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, thalamus. They are receiving inputs from ventroposterolateral nucleus of thalamus to the Brodmann area 312. Here, that would be able to give the localization of the pain, and that would be able to give the attributes of the pain, because this S1 connects to S2 and the association area, that would be able to give the attributes of the pain. Then it will, with the help of the somatosensory association area, especially the parieto, occipital, temporal area, it will try to locate the postural, the eyeball movement and the head movement, and in reflection to the sound, they are all been localized there. So the parieto-occipital temporal area, because they project onto the colliculus there, and they will try to make these movements, the postural eye and head coordinates in place. And at the same time, this S1 and S2 are a somatosensory area that would activate the limbic system, the hippocampus, the amygdala, because it's coming from this direction, hippocampus, amygdala, then to the insular cortex, then to the anterior cingulate cortex, and then to the prefrontal cortex that would be activated. So that is how it's processed in the parietal cortex S1. Then what happens to the pain fibers, which are the fibers at cingulate cortex? So this is the corpus callosum there. Over the corpus callosum, we have the cingulate cortex. This cingulate cortex is divided into the anterior part and the posterior part. The anterior cingulate cortex is involved in the pain processing. Now, from the thalamus, the medial dorsal nucleus of the thalamus, they project onto the anterior cingulate cortex. And this anterior cingulate cortex, that would give the somatomotor area. This is somatomotor area, and that would have the connections with the posterior cingulate cortex. That will have a connection with the posterior cingulate cortex. And this posterior cingulate cortex receives inputs from S2, that's somatosensory area 2. Now, the anterior cingulate cortex talks to the prefrontal lobe. This is the prefrontal lobe. Talks to the prefrontal lobe, because the prefrontal lobe has the executive functions and higher functions that would give the decision making. That is the main decision making body, and that would talk to that, and what is this and what is happening and what to do, and all those things would be obtained from the frontal cortex. So now this, then after that, it sends impulses back to the thalamus and back to the basal ganglia and amygdala to the periequidectal gray or downwards. So now if I were to talk about this cingulate cortex is connected to S1, somatosensory area, the thalamus, amygdala, thalamus, amygdala, the basal ganglia, the insular cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the caudate nucleus, and nucleus accumbens somewhere here, nucleus accumbens is somewhere here, hypothalamus, and periaqueductal gray and parabrachial nucleus. That is how it is connected. A very, very large, rich in connection. The affective, and this is for affective and motivational aspects. Motivational aspects of the pain. The affective means if it is bothersome, emotional responses, and then you try to get dismotivational. Here I'm taking in the negative connotation. That means if you are hurt, you will be dismotivated. You will not be happy, and if you are not happy, you don't feel like doing any activity. So this is coming from the cingulate cortex. Emotional responses to pain, so that means you are dejected and you are having a sort of anxiety. What happens, why it is not subsiding, especially in the night, you will not be able to sleep. So all that the pain type of sensations, they would go through these emotional cingulate cortex. Of course, the cingulate cortex gets the information from the thalamus, from these paleo spinothalamic tract, and from the parabrachial, amygdalar, insular ACC pathway. Now, what finally is required? So these, they will try to modulate the pain by reducing the sensory inputs. So that means they will try to modulate the pain by modulating the sensory inputs at the thalamic level. Thalamic level, one at the periaqueductal gray, which in turn will send impulses to the spinal neurons or the projecting neurons. So now that also trying to the affective, motivational, and cognitive factors. So that means you will not be able to perform any activity as you wish to. Lesions do not alter the pain rating. So pain rating is done with the S1 level, this pink one. This is the magnitude of the pain or the intensity of the pain. Maybe they are done with the S1 and a part of the insular cortex. So they will not alter that. But because you have removed this thing, now the pain has become less bothersome. It does not bother him. Oh, he will say that, okay, pain is there, it does not hurt me, or it does not bother me. That means it is not bothering him psychologically. So that means, so this psychological component of the pain is processed here in the anterior cingulate cortex. This is an affective component. Now, moving on to the cingulate. I have already discussed about the cingulate cortex. Then move on to the insular cortex. Move on to the insular cortex. The insular cortex, this is the insular cortex here. What happens from thalamus and from the parabrachial nucleus, the amygdala and the insular cortex receives inputs. Amygdala and insular cortex receives inputs. This insular cortex is having a connection with the S2 there, and it is having a connection with the ACC. And this will give back to the thalamus, to this is these things, and it's also connected to the prefrontal cortex through the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, what it does, it helps the processing, sensory processing with S2. Especially in terms of the intensity discrimination, in terms of the good or bad component of the pain. And it tries to integrate the pain and other responses, other pain-related responses. That means the reflexes, the posture, and other components. And it will try to give the introspection. That means it tries to give the thinking whether it should be carried further to the anterior cingulate cortex. What it does, what are the emotional responses, trying to console yourself, trying to help yourself to the perspective. At the same time, it will have a social perspective. Sometimes what happens, it may be very painful, but I may not cry. If I am alone, I will cry. So this particular feeling, see, for example, I have a pain, I will try to be bold so that a social perspective is maintained. At the same time, if you are looking at a soldier fighting in the front line, what happens? He may be losing his limb because of the injury, but he does not feel the pain. This is a social perspective of the insular cortex, and it helps the decision making, especially the decision making in reference to the prefrontal cortex. And at the same time, it will help the autonomic responses which are coming from the hypothalamus to the medulla, and then further down to sympathetic and parasympathetic components. So these are all the functions of the insular cortex. The inputs which are reaching, they perform all of these things. Now, lesions of the insular cortex produce a loss of these emotional or affective quality, while the discriminative components remain intact. Same thing as with the anterior cingulate cortex ablation. Then we have a pain processing at a prefrontal cortex. This is a prefrontal cortex. It's a prefrontal cortex. This prefrontal cortex receives inputs from thalamus first, then through anterior cingulate cortex, through, that means insular cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and then to the prefrontal cortex. Then to the S1, that is somatosensory cortex, through the insular cortex, and then here. And it also receives inputs from the amygdala. Amygdala is somewhere here. And from the hypothalamus. And from the parabolical nucleus to the amygdala and to this. So that means it receives a large range. Almost all parts of the cerebral cortex are connected with the prefrontal cortex. This is the dorsal prefrontal cortex. So that means it analyzes all the inputs, it takes the decisions, it is for the executive functions of the entire activity, and it will decide about, because in experimental things, so when there is an acute or a chronic pain situation, in that situation, there is a change in the neurotransmitter expressions here, neurotransmitter expressions, gene expressions for the neurotransmitters and other things in the prefrontal cortex, because that is because of the acute pain. And even the glial proliferation here and inflammation, neuroinflammation has been observed in the prefrontal cortex. Thus, the pain is directly or altering certain functions of the prefrontal cortex. And this prefrontal cortex, that helps the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex. Anterior cingulate cortex is a executive part, insular cortex is a thinking part of the whatever the things the prefrontal cortex are trying to utilize. The medial prefrontal cortex has a dual roles. So that means it has a hypothalamic and other midbrain structures. One, it has the antinociceptive actions. So that means antinociceptive, it suppresses the pain. How it suppresses the pain? So it suppresses the S1 activity via the networks. And it suppresses the limbic activity, that is amygdalar and hippocampal activity, limbic activity. And it suppresses the Amygdala in turn suppresses the periaqueductal activity, or it enhances the periaqueductal activity so that the pain is suppressed. That is anti-nociceptive. Once the periaqueductal is activated, and it will again further descends down to the gate of the spinal cord. So then pronociceptive activity, that means it has another opposing role, pronociceptive. This pronociceptive is coming through the basal ganglia. So corticostriatal, that means this is the prefrontal cortex, then it comes to the motor cortex. From the motor cortex, we have the basal ganglia here, and these basal ganglia are activated. And the tegmental part, that is somewhere in the midbrain or just above the midbrain, and even the nucleus accumbens, they are for the reward pathways, dopaminergic reward pathways. They are suppressed and they will become activated. So that means that would produce the nociception, continue to produce the nociception, and this leads to chronicity. So this produces the pain becomes chronic in nature. Usually this antinociceptive activity suppresses and abolishes pain, whereas this one keeps the pain on and it goes into chronic, because some of the pain, especially the pains originating from the malignancies or neurogenic pains, they would have this chronicity. One thing is clear. Prefrontal cortex does not alter the sensory modality. So that means what is coming here to S1, it has nothing to do. So that means the person feels the pain, he knows the pain modality, he knows the intensity, but the psychological, emotional, and mental attributes are not processed here. So that means he is not bothered, as happened in case of the acute cingulate cortex. These things, it does not bother him. He does not care. Even if pain is there, let it be there, because it's not. As long as he's not bothered, he's fine with that. So like that situation, it does not alter the sensory modality. However, the psychological, mental attributes are hampered, or not there. They do not exist. Now, coming back to the summary, I just summarize with each one of them. Local site, shorting, sensitization, attention, solacing. The second, spinal cord, again shorting, synapsing, convergence, modulation, gating. That is the spinal cord. Number 3, medulla, autonomic, reticulothalamic for arousal, reticulospinal for modulator. Pontomedullary, that is a parabrachial nucleus, that is through the amygdala, hypothalamus, and insular and the cingulate cortex, that would be for emotional component of the pain. The midbrain, the periaqueductal gray, so and the reticular system, they would be inhibitory around because of the encaphylinergic, and activate the medullary reticulospinal tract to inhibit the gate. So that means they have a reciprocal connections with the amygdala, hypothalamus, anterior cingulate cortex, the insular cortex, and the prefrontal cortex. That's about the midbrain. The thalamic components have 4 connections. The ventroposterolateral, that is for discriminatory pain, the medial dorsal and the medial posterior, ventromedial posterior, these are for affective component or emotional components. The reticular and the internal medullary laminae, so these are for the arousal response or awake state. Then we have the pain reaching the parietal cortex. It is for localization and attributes. Amygdalar contribution for pain is emotional and the responses, emotional responses through the hypothalamus, and the memory, retention, and attention seeking. These are for the amygdala. The cingulate cortex is again affective, emotional, and worrying type or bothering type. The insular cortex, that would help the S1 area, S1 parietal area for the intensity, integration, and it will help the cingulate area for emotion and discrimination, and it will help the prefrontal area for emotional discrimination and other decision making in terms of the social and autonomic functions. The prefrontal cortex, it has a dual connections, dual systems, the pro and anti-nociception. Though it is not participating actually in the pain receival, but the long-term pain effects are being processed by the prefrontal cortex. So this leads to the chronicity and the psychological attributes. This is the summary of the processing of the pain. Okay. I have maybe I have referred these books and especially in addition to these Candles, Neuroscience, Guidance, Textbook of Physiology, Genon's Review, I have referenced a number of books which I have mentioned in between, especially this book by Bessebaum, or this article by Bessebaum for cellular and molecular mechanism of pain. That becomes very relevant. This is published in the journal Cell. Now, the assignments here describe the pathways involved in the nociception with the help of a neat label diagram, because I have given you again one more thing, briefly mention about the processing of pain at various levels. Now, okay, that's one full part. You may get it something like that, or you may get a short notes like pain processing at the site of injury, at spinal cord, at medulla, at midbrain, at thalamus, at sensory cortex, that is a parietal area, at cingulate cortex, that pericortical gray, or processing in the insular cortex, the prefrontal cortex in pain processing, the affective part of pain, the anti-nociceptive mechanisms, reticular system in pain, paleo-spinothalamic tract, and the neospinothalamic tract. In the next lecture, I would cover the modulation of pain and the physiological basis of pain treatment. That can be possible. For that reason, to come up to this level, I have to give the processing at various levels. Now, in the next lecture, I will deal with what is the basis for pain treatment and how the pain can be suppressed at various levels. Thank you.